Most men believe their perception of women is based on experience, but in reality, it is built on dependency patterns they have never examined. They think they are responding to women, when in truth they are responding to what women represent in their psychological structure. Validation, relief, direction, and emotional regulation become entangled with attraction so deeply that the man cannot distinguish between what he sees and what he needs. This confusion creates a false intensity that feels real, but is structurally unstable. When a man lives alone long enough, that instability is exposed in a way that cannot be avoided or explained away. Without the constant presence of female attention or interaction, the emotional fluctuations he once blamed on women begin to reveal their true source. He starts to notice that the anxiety, the anticipation, the overanalysis were not reactions to her behavior, but reactions to his own lack of internal grounding. This realization is not dramatic, but it is precise enough to dismantle years of unconscious habits. There is an overlooked psychological principle that rarely gets discussed in modern conversations about attraction, and it is this: a man cannot perceive clearly what he is unconsciously depending on. Dependency distorts observation by forcing the mind to prioritize emotional outcomes over factual patterns. As long as a man needs something from a woman to stabilize himself, he will interpret her behavior in ways that protect that need. This is why inconsistency often gets labeled as mystery and emotional distance gets reframed as complexity. Extended solitude removes the ability to maintain that distortion because there is no longer an immediate reward for misinterpretation. There is no interaction to reinforce the illusion, no feedback loop to justify projection, and no emotional payoff to keep the narrative alive. In the absence of those reinforcements, the mind is forced into a more neutral position. That neutrality is what allows perception to recalibrate into something far more accurate. As this recalibration begins, the man starts to notice something uncomfortable but undeniable. Many of the women he once found deeply compelling were not compelling in themselves, but in how they interacted with his unresolved patterns. The attraction was not entirely about who they were, but about how they activated something within him that he had never fully understood. Once that internal pattern is identified, the external stimulus loses much of its power. This is where a critical shift occurs in how he sees women, and it is not rooted in detachment, but in differentiation. He begins to separate the woman from the experience he was having in her presence. Before, those two things were fused together, making it impossible to tell whether he was responding to her or to his own internal reactions. Now he can observe her behavior independently of how it makes him feel, which is a level of clarity most men never reach. There is a concept in deeper psychological analysis that describes this process as delinking stimulus from self-referential interpretation. In simpler terms, it means the man is no longer placing himself at the center of every interaction. He is no longer asking what her behavior means about him, but instead what it reveals about her. This shift removes the emotional urgency from perception and replaces it with something far more stable: observation without immediate involvement. As a result, patterns that once took months to understand become visible within minutes. He begins to recognize emotional inconsistency not as intrigue, but as instability. He notices when interest is conditional rather than consistent, and when attention is given strategically rather than genuinely. These observations do not make him cynical, but they do make him precise in a way that changes how he engages entirely. The most significant difference is that he stops reacting in real time and starts evaluating over time. Before, attraction was immediate and often overwhelming, driven by how the interaction made him feel in the moment. Now he pays more attention to how he feels after the interaction has ended, when the emotional stimulation has subsided. This delayed evaluation reveals far more truth than the initial experience ever could. What emerges from this process is not indifference, but a new form of selectivity that is grounded in reality rather than projection. He is no longer impressed by intensity alone, because he understands that intensity can be generated without substance. Instead, he begins to value continuity, coherence, and alignment across different moments in context. These qualities are quieter, but far more reliable indicators of genuine compatibility. At this stage, women stop appearing as solutions to an internal problem and start appearing as individuals with their own structures, limitations, and patterns. The pedestal dissolves not because he lowers their value, but because he removes the distortion that inflated it in the first place. What remains is a more accurate and therefore more stable perception. This change is subtle enough that most people around him will not notice it directly, but they will feel it in how he interacts. There is less urgency in his attention, less need to impress, and less tolerance for inconsistency. He is not trying to be distant, but he is no longer available in the same unconscious way he once was. His presence becomes more deliberate because it is no longer driven by an internal lack that needs to be filled. And this is only the beginning of how his perception changes, because what follows is even more significant. Once a man stops needing women to regulate his internal state, he begins to evaluate them based on a completely different set of criteria. The question is no longer whether she is interested in him, but whether her presence aligns with the structure he has built within himself. That shift alone eliminates most of the confusion that used to dominate his interactions. What replaces the old way of seeing is not detachment in the way most people imagine it, but something far more exacting. It is a form of attention that is no longer distorted by urgency. And because of that, it begins to detect things most men completely miss. The man who has lived alone long enough does not become less observant. He becomes selectively observant, focusing not on what is presented, but on what remains consistent beneath presentation. This distinction is subtle, but it is where almost all misjudgment in attraction originates. Before this shift, he was highly responsive to surface-level signals because those signals fed directly into his emotional state. A change in tone, a delayed response, a moment of warmth or withdrawal. These things carried exaggerated meaning because they affected how he felt about himself. His perception was not neutral, it was reactive, and that reactivity created a constant state of interpretation. He wasn't observing her behavior as much as he was decoding it for personal implications. Solitude dismantles that decoding process by removing its incentive. When there is no emotional dependency tied to the outcome, the need to interpret everything in self-referential terms disappears. What remains is a quieter, more stable form of awareness that is not trying to extract meaning for immediate use. This allows him to observe patterns across time, instead of reacting to isolated moments. One of the first things he begins to notice is the difference between consistency and performance. Many people, not just women, are capable of presenting a version of themselves that is coherent for short periods of time. They can be attentive, engaging, and aligned in ways that feel genuine, but that coherence often breaks when circumstances change. The man who has developed internal stability is no longer impressed by initial alignment, because he understands that real structure reveals itself only through repetition. There is a psychological idea rarely discussed outside of deeper behavioral studies that states short-term alignment is often a function of context, not character. This becomes painfully obvious once a man has removed his need for immediate connection. He starts to observe how a woman behaves not only when things are smooth, but when there is friction, ambiguity, or inconvenience. Those moments carry more information than any initial display of interest ever could. As a result, attraction becomes slower, but far more accurate. He is no longer driven by the intensity of the first interaction, because he understands that intensity can be artificially generated through novelty and uncertainty. Instead, he begins to look for continuity and behavior across different situations. He watches for how she handles inconsistency, how she responds to boundaries, and whether her actions remain aligned with her words over time. This change fundamentally alters how he experiences desire. Before, desire was immediate and often overwhelming, tied closely to how stimulated he felt in her presence. Now, desire becomes something that develops through observation rather than reaction. It is not triggered by what is obvious, but by what proves itself over time, which makes it far more resistant to illusion. Another shift that occurs is in how he interprets emotional fluctuation. What once felt like depth or complexity now appears as instability or lack of internal regulation. He no longer romanticizes unpredictability because he has experienced what internal stability feels like within himself. This creates a natural aversion to dynamics that introduce unnecessary volatility into his life. There is a form of psychological clarity that emerges when a man becomes familiar with his own baseline. He knows what his life feels like when it is undisturbed, when it is structured according to his own rhythm rather than external influence.